So now we're going to talk about dynamic processing on program material. We're going to bridge the gap between the technical side of things and go into the creative side of things and see how that connection can be formed. And really, that's the heart of what a mix engineer does, bridging the idea of shape and mixing it with the idea of musicality. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a snare drum. And I'm going to play the snare drum in solo, and we're just going to listen to some of the characteristics of that snare. Now, it's hard to describe something if you don't think about shape. But once we start thinking about shape, it becomes much easier to put characteristics on it. For example, there's a crunchiness that happens sort of in the space between the attack and the sustain, which we call the decay. So there's that crunchiness in the decay. There's also sort of this whoo kind of tone that comes off of the snare in the sustain. That's the resonance of the snare drum. These two things tell me that A, it's a metal-rimmed snare, and B, the snare band is tight because what's not there is the rattle of the snare. So we have a nice, tight sounding metal snare drum. Okay, cool. Now, what do we want to do with it? Well, that's all context dependent, and I can show you a couple of things that we can do. Now, what we choose to do might be different, but let's take a look at it. First, we are going to show how to make a fat sounding snare, always spelled with a PH, always. The way we do this is basically by getting the sustain sound to connect and become louder relative to the attack, meaning we need to push the attack down while maintaining the sound and integrity of the sustain. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, the attack sound is very fast. That's the sound of the stick hitting the head of the snare. It's that first physical impact that's being picked up by the microphone. It only lasts maybe 10 milliseconds, maybe even less. It's quick. So what we're going to do is we are going to set the attack very, very fast on the compressor right here. We have half a millisecond, so it works immediately when the threshold is breached. And we're also going to set the release very, very fast because we want to get the compressor out of the way of the sustain. So I have it set to 5 milliseconds, which is the lowest that it can go. And then I'm going to adjust the threshold to where I'm hitting the attack, but I'm not doing anything to the sustain. And what's going to happen is you're going to hear the decay and the sustain come up in level. So here is a before and after. Suddenly that crunch becomes a lot more pronounced, and also that sort of metallic ring becomes a little bit more pronounced. Also, just as a side note, and I'm going to talk about this later, the apparent volume of the snare becomes louder. But we're going to talk about that in a bit. Okay, so we can also go in reverse. We don't necessarily, this is dynamic processing, not specifically just squishing something. We can actually do the opposite. And we can do it using a compressor. What we're going to do now is we're going to separate the sustain and attack. We're going to make the attack feel more pronounced relative to the level of the sustain. The way we do this is we set the threshold lower. We set the threshold low enough so that even the decay and sustain is still above the level where we've set the threshold. So the volume is still exceeding it. The difference here is that the attack is going to be set very slow. Now I'm setting a 50 millisecond attack. That's 100 times faster than what we did in the previous example. And the release is going to be a little bit slower as well, but that's mainly to avoid something called modulation distortion. That's another subject. We're going to get to it later. But the bottom line is that the attack is taking so long that 10 millisecond attack of the snare drum isn't really being pulled down. It's only getting to pull the signal down when we get to the sustain of the drum. And here's the before and after. Notice how some of that crunchiness goes away and some of the resonance seems to fade away, but the physical sound, the impact sound of the snare becomes more apparent. That's what we're doing with this type of compression. So when you think, do I add compression? The answer is no, you don't add compression. What you do is you change dynamics. And what you do with a compressor or any dynamic processor is as flexible as what you could do with an EQ. It really just depends on what you're trying to do. Now, of course, the question is, which is the right decision? Well, that all comes down to the music. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the music, and I'm going to play just the dry sound of the snare, and then we're going to try the different ones that we've come up with. First of all, just the dry, unaffected snare sounds good. Now, to me, I feel like it needs something more. I wouldn't mind hearing either more character or more life and energy. So let's try it with the fat setting on the snare. I definitely like that. Let's try it with the punchy setting. I like that too. I think that either of those could actually work. Ultimately, I have to make a choice. Which is going to be more important for what we're trying to do? Is it the character of the snare, or is it the physical impact of the snare? And that ultimately is a decision the producer would make. In this particular case, what I decided to do was to go with the punchier snare, the one that's more physically impactful. In hip-hop, that's usually a safe choice. I feel either choice in this particular case is a safe choice. It's an improvement. Sometimes it's hard to tell which is best. But I did something a little bit unique, actually. The change from the original snare to the newer snare with the compression on it that's exaggerating the punch is almost like a change in the way the drummer is playing. It's almost as if the drummer is using a lot more wrist bounce and a stronger stroke, as opposed to the normal one, which kind of feels like a regular stroke. This one's almost an extra flick of the wrist. So when dealing with program materials, a lot of times it's the same snare again and again and again. And one way to liven it up is to actually switch this kind of compression processing around so that you create an automated change in the dynamic of the snare. And that's what I ultimately did, and it sounds like this. The first snare you hear on the 2-beat is going to be the original. The second one that hits on the 4-beat is going to be the one with the compression. This is where the technical meets the creative. We use these technical concepts to create a musical effect.